How did humanity abandon an entire architectural tradition of harvesting energy? Buildings built with conductive spires, copper-tipped finials, and intricate metal frameworks seemingly meant to draw upon the electrical charge of the atmosphere and trade it for a centralized electrical system where power was generated elsewhere, carried through wires measured by meters, and sold back to the public without anyone asking what had been given up along the way. Was this simply the natural march of technological progress? Or did something happen that made an entire energy system obsolete almost overnight? Well, stay tuned because today we'll uncover what really happened to the world's forgotten energy systems, and why they vanished just as electricity became something people had to pay for. Trust us, the truth is much darker. Chapter 1. The day the sky turned red. We're going to start with a very simple date. September 1st, 1859. That is the date history remembers. The night skies burned red across North America, Europe, Australia, and places far beyond the regions where auroras normally belonged. Those ghostly curtains of light appeared over Cuba, the Bahamas, Colombia, and Queensland. Telegraph stations crackled with electrical discharges. Operators reported sparks jumping from their equipment, and in several documented cases, telegraph circuits continued transmitting after their batteries had been disconnected. The accepted explanation begins with British astronomer Richard Carrington. From his private observatory at Redhill in Surrey, Carrington was studying a large group of sunspots when he witnessed two extraordinarily bright patches appear across the solar surface. Roughly 17 hours later, Earth was struck by an exceptionally powerful geomagnetic disturbance. Today, the event is understood as an enormous solar eruption whose charged material disturbed Earth's magnetic field and induced currents through long conductive systems on the ground. Telegraph networks across Europe and North America suffered badly. Equipment malfunctioned, sparks flew, and fires were started at several stations. That explanation accounts remarkably well for the red skies and the telegraph chaos. But there is one historical detail worth holding on to. Some telegraph operators discovered that their lines could work temporarily with the batteries disconnected, using electrical currents induced in the wires during the storm itself. In other words, for a brief moment, long stretches of metal wire were carrying usable electrical current without their ordinary power source. And this is where the lesser-known story becomes super stranger. Look through photographs and architectural drawings of 19th century cities, and another feature repeatedly appears above the skyline: metal spires, copper-tipped finials, lightning conductors, ornamental ironwork, and elaborate rooftop structures crowning churches, railway stations, hotels, universities, government buildings, and civic halls. London had them. Paris had them. St. Petersburg, New York, Chicago, Buenos Aires, Bombay, and Shanghai had variations of the same architectural language. Conventionally, there is nothing mysterious about much of this. Spires had religious and aesthetic purposes, metal finials were decorative, lightning conductors protected structures from electrical storms. Benjamin Franklin's work had already established the practical value of directing lightning safely toward the ground. But alternative history circles have long attached another interpretation to these old skylines. According to those less established theories, certain rooftop structures were not merely decorative or protective. They were supposedly connected with metalwork extending deeper into buildings' iron frameworks, pipes, conduits, and fixtures which proponents interpret as remnants of an atmospheric electrical system. Mainstream architectural history does not support that conclusion, and surviving metalwork usually has far more ordinary explanations: structural reinforcement, heating, plumbing, ventilation, lightning protection, or decoration. Still, the theory becomes interesting because of what happened next. During the 19th century, countless older buildings underwent aggressive restoration, alteration, or demolition. One of the most famous figures involved was French architect Yung Viet Le Duc, whose restorations included major medieval monuments such as Notre Dame de Paris. He studied medieval construction obsessively and frequently altered buildings according to his interpretation of what they should have been. Alternative accounts sometimes claim that unusual internal metal systems were discovered or removed during these restorations. Evidence for a forgotten electrical network, however, remains unverified. Across the Atlantic, another transformation was unfolding. In the decades surrounding and following the American Civil War, cities demolished, remodeled, and replaced huge numbers of buildings. Contemporary explanations were usually mundane: deterioration, changing tastes, fire risk, expanding populations, new transportation needs, and structures considered unsuitable for modern use. But old photos leave behind a curious visual contrast. Earlier civic architecture often appears very ornate: towers, domes, pinnacles, finials, ironwork, and crowded roof lines reaching upward. Many later buildings became comparatively restrained, particularly as construction methods and architectural fashions changed. Fewer elaborate spires, fewer ornamental rods, cleaner roofs, simpler silhouettes. None of that proves that 19th century cities possessed a forgotten free energy network. But place those photographs beside the events of September 1859, when electrical currents really were induced through man-made conductive systems by a disturbance above Earth, and an uncomfortable question begins to form. Were those old rooftops merely reaching toward the sky for beauty and protection? Or have we misunderstood what at least some of them were built to do? Chapter 2. The story Carrington couldn't explain. To answer these perplexing questions, we've got to return to September 1st, 1859, because the story history eventually settled on is considerably neater than the one Carrington himself really told. Richard Carrington was no careless observer. His drawing of the brilliant solar eruption he witnessed that morning was meticulous, and his report to the Royal Astronomical Society was remarkably restrained. Most importantly, Carrington did not claim that he had proven the sun caused the magnetic disturbance that followed. He noticed the extraordinary coincidence, but specifically cautioned against building a conclusion from a single event. The confidence came later. Over the following decades, the explanation hardened into the familiar sequence: solar eruption, geomagnetic storm, telegraph disruption. Modern science provides strong evidence for that connection, but the surviving reports from 1859 contain details that remain fascinating. Telegraph systems did not merely stop working. Currents appeared where operators expected none. Equipment sparked violently, shocks were reported, and the famous Boston to Portland line was operated for an era with its batteries disconnected, relying on geomagnetically induced current. But telegraph wires were hardly the only conductive structures covering 19th century cities. Railroads stretched across enormous distances. Gas and water systems contained extensive metalwork. Above them stood thousands of churches, stations, universities, government buildings, and civic halls crowned with rods, finials, towers, and metal-tipped spires. So what happened to those structures that night? Strangely, the surviving record tells us very little. Telegraph operators belonged to a technical profession with journals, newspapers, colleagues, and a vocabulary for describing electrical abnormalities. When their instruments began behaving impossibly, they documented it. But picture a cathedral caretaker in Lyon, a university groundskeeper in Edinburgh, or a building owner in New York. Had metalwork inside a tower crackled, glowed, hummed, or discharged during that extraordinary storm, how would someone in 1859 have interpreted it? More importantly, where would such an observation have been recorded? That missing testimony has encouraged a far more controversial interpretation. According to theories, 19th century architecture contained features whose purpose may have extended beyond ornament, towering central spires, conductive finials, roof structures, internal ironwork, hanging metal fixtures, and other interconnected elements. Even geometric flooring and building orientation have been pulled into the argument. Mainstream architectural history offers conventional explanations for these features, and there is no accepted evidence that they formed an electrical network. Claims that entire cities were precisely aligned to exploit Earth's electromagnetic field are especially speculative. Religious tradition, geography, existing streets, sunlight, terrain, and urban planning explain much of what we see. Still, one historical subject makes the question harder to dismiss completely: atmospheric electricity itself. 19th-century scientists genuinely studied electricity in the atmosphere and its relationship with Earth. Then, decades later, Nikola Tesla pushed those ideas much further. Through resonance, high-frequency electricity, and experiments involving Earth and the atmosphere, Tesla imagined electrical transmission on an enormous scale. Wardenclyffe Tower, begun in 1901, became the most famous expression of that ambition. Tesla often wrote about extracting energy from nature and famously described the universe as a vast mechanism, the wheelwork of nature. Some alternative accounts go considerably further, claiming Tesla believed he was recovering knowledge possessed by an earlier civilization. That interpretation remains unproven. His surviving writings do not establish the existence of a forgotten worldwide power grid. But Tesla did understand something important: Earth, atmosphere, conductivity, resonance, and electrical potential were not separate curiosities. They could be studied as parts of a larger physical system. And suddenly those old skylines invite another look. What if at least some of those spires served purposes we have misunderstood? What if certain metal structures were functional rather than purely ornamental? And what if similarities between monumental buildings from Santiago de Compostela to Cologne and Canterbury preserved engineering traditions whose original reasoning became obscured over centuries? None of that proves an ancient electrical network existed. But according to the more radical version of the theory, something far greater once connected these structures, something accumulated across generations rather than invented by a single engineer. And then came 1859. If such a system really existed, what would the most violent geomagnetic storm in recorded history have done to it? Because that possibility leads us to the question this entire story ultimately depends upon: what if the Carrington event didn't merely disrupt the old system? What if it destroyed it? Chapter 3. The power grid hidden in the architecture. Suppose, for a moment, that atmospheric electricity really could be harvested on a large scale. What would such a system actually require? Probably not a single machine. More likely, it would depend on a network of tall, conductive structures, carefully positioned, built to particular heights, connected through the buildings and communities beneath them. And that is where the architectural pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Versions of this same vertical design appear across Paris and Peking, London and Lima, Moscow and Mumbai, Cairo and Constantinople, Boston and Buenos Aires. Conventional history explains much of that similarity through trade, religion, imperial influence, shared engineering traditions, and the spread of architectural styles. Those explanations matter, but they do not answer every question raised by alternative researchers. Long before modern globalization, cultures with no clearly documented contact were already building monumental structures around the same basic idea: height, orientation, and a prominent apex often capped or decorated with metal. Copper, bronze, iron, gold. Why place conductive material at the highest point? Symbolism may explain some examples, but according to lesser-known theories, The repeated use of metal at elevated points suggests that function may once have mattered as much as appearance. Then the visual record changes. Photographs and daguerreotypes from the mid-19th century often show dense skylines crowded with towers, elaborate finials, roof ornaments, and complicated metalwork. By the 1870s and 1880s, many cities had begun simplifying those roof lines. Structures were altered, demolished, or stripped back under the language of improvement, modernization, structural necessity, and urban renewal. The strange part is how often the detailed reasoning is difficult to recover. And all of this unfolded while modern electromagnetic science was taking shape. Maxwell published the equations that unified electricity and magnetism in the 1860s. Hertz later demonstrated electromagnetic waves experimentally during the 1880s. So within roughly the same historical window, one understanding of electricity was becoming formalized while older architectural practices were being abandoned. That does not prove the two developments were connected. But the overlap is hard to resist examining. Copper markets were also changing rapidly as telegraph systems, industry, construction, and later electrical networks demanded enormous amounts of metal. Alternative interpretations sometimes suggest that falling demand from older architectural uses may also have played a role, although surviving trade records do not establish that conclusion. Similar claims appear around architectural manuals. Researchers have argued that elaborate rooftop systems became less prominent in later 19th century design literature, gradually giving way to simpler forms rather than being formally debunked. There are even scattered stories of craftsmen being ordered to remove copper fixtures and rooftop elements from otherwise serviceable buildings. One frequently repeated story describes an Edinburgh stonemason in the 1860s recording his confusion after copper fittings were taken from a civic structure that appeared to be in perfectly good condition. The provenance of that diary is difficult to verify, so it should be treated cautiously. Still, the broader question remains. If these structures were nothing more than decoration, why did so much of that architectural language begin disappearing during the very decades when humanity was redefining electricity itself? Once that question enters the story, the old skylines stop looking quite so ordinary. Chapter 4. The evidence that quietly disappeared there is another part of the Carrington story that becomes stranger the longer we sit with it. Nearly everything we know about those two extraordinary days comes from two sources: newspapers describing the aurora and telegraph operators documenting what happened to their equipment. That makes sense. The sky was impossible to miss, and telegraph workers belonged to an organized profession that knew how to record electrical problems when they occurred. But what about everything else made of metal? There was no worldwide system for documenting unusual behavior in church towers, civic buildings, institutional rooftops, internal ironwork, or other conductive structures. So if something unusual happened there, the historical record may never have captured it in any organized way. This is where lesser-known accounts become interesting. According to scattered architectural and institutional references cited by alternative researchers, some 19th century buildings supposedly had maintenance routines involving what were described as atmospheric conductors, rooftop charge systems, and other elevated metal installations. Certain university records are also claimed to mention caretakers responsible for rooftop equipment whose purpose is not clearly explained in surviving descriptions. None of this proves those systems generated power. But if those records are authentic, another curiosity follows. After 1859, references to such specialized maintenance roles appear, according to these accounts, to become less common over the following years. There is no dramatic announcement, no official declaration that an old technology had failed. The terminology simply fades. And that absence may be more important than it sounds. When an old system disappears, the strongest evidence is not always the machinery itself. Sometimes it is the gap left behind, mounting points where fixtures once stood, altered roof lines, discontinued job titles, missing manuals, abandoned procedures, and technical language that suddenly stops appearing. We should also be careful here. There is no verified archive proving that a worldwide atmospheric energy network existed before the Carrington event, nor solid evidence that governments deliberately erased one afterward. What does exist is an uneven historical record. Daguerreotypes from the 1840s and 1850s preserve cities with astonishing visual detail, yet practical documentation explaining every rooftop fitting. Internal metal connection, maintenance routine, and specialized fixture is far less complete. History often works that way. Photographs survive. Manuals vanish. Buildings remain while the people who understood them do not. And that leaves us with surviving examples. Across older European districts, university campuses, churches, and occasional civic buildings, original finials, rods, and elaborate metal features can still be found. When viewed as engineering rather than ornament, their placement sometimes feels deliberate. Maybe that impression means nothing more than good 19th century craftsmanship. Or maybe we are looking at fragments of a function whose original purpose was gradually forgotten. Because whatever these systems were meant to do, by the end of the century, the world was moving toward something entirely different. Chapter 5. What really changed after 1859? Scientists estimate that another Carrington-level storm today could cause trillions of dollars in damage, knocking out satellites, communication networks, and electrical grids across enormous regions. For our civilization, that could be catastrophic. But the world of 1859 was built very differently. If, as some alternative theories suggest, certain buildings once interacted with atmospheric electricity through distributed conductive systems, then perhaps the storm did more than temporarily interfere with them. A surge powerful enough to operate disconnected telegraph lines might also have overloaded or damaged equipment that had taken generations to develop. That possibility becomes more interesting when we look at what followed. Within a few decades, the relationship between buildings and energy had changed dramatically. Coal and gas expanded, electrical utilities emerged, centralized generation became practical, and eventually electricity became something produced elsewhere, delivered through dedicated wires, measured and sold. Meanwhile, many of the elaborate rooftop features discussed earlier were altered, simplified, or removed. There was no great public argument over an older energy system being abandoned, because there is no reliable evidence that such a system officially existed in the first place. And perhaps that is the most frustrating part of this entire story. The accepted explanation of the Carrington event makes scientific sense. Carrington witnessed a solar eruption, an enormous geomagnetic storm followed, telegraph networks suffered severe disturbances, and eventually life carried on. But what if the world that carried on afterward was already beginning to become different from the one that entered September 1859? Knowledge does not always disappear through conspiracy or destruction. Sometimes the people who understand a system grow old, buildings are renovated, components are discarded, manuals are forgotten, and the next generation learns an entirely different way of doing things. Within several decades, something once functional can become an ornament whose original purpose nobody remembers. Many of those old structures are still standing. Their spires still rise above streets, their metal finials remain in place, and the atmosphere above them still carries an electrical charge. Perhaps they were always nothing more than architecture and lightning protection. Or perhaps somewhere among forgotten maintenance records, engineering manuals, and 19th century correspondence lies a detail capable of changing how we understand them. Because after everything we have examined, one question remains. When the sky finally returned to normal in September 1859, Did everything beneath it return to normal too? If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later.